The Vanishing at the Cave. In the early spring of 1982, a high school in Kentucky organized a field trip to a cave system renowned for its geological formations and rich history. The students, excited for a day out of the classroom, eagerly boarded the buses that would take them deep into the Kentucky wilderness. The cave was located far from any town, nestled within a dense forest that seemed untouched by time. As the group arrived at the entrance, their guide, an older man named Mr. Grayson, gave them a stern warning: "These caves are vast and easy to get lost in. Stay close to the group and do not wander off." The students nodded, eager to explore the mysteries that lay beneath the earth. Among the students was Laura, a quiet girl who had always been fascinated by the unknown. She was drawn to the cave's dark corridors, feeling an inexplicable connection to the shadows that lurked within. As they ventured deeper into the cave, the air grew colder, and the light from their flashlights seemed to barely pierce the oppressive darkness. The group passed through chambers adorned with stalactites and stalagmites, their beauty lost in the eerie silence that surrounded them. Every sound, every drip of water, every shuffle of feet, was magnified in the stillness of the cave. It was in this unsettling quiet that Laura first noticed a narrow passageway branching off from the main path. The passage was almost hidden, its entrance shadowed and uninviting. As the rest of the group moved on, Laura hesitated, staring into the dark tunnel. It seemed to call to her, beckoning her to explore its secrets. Ignoring the guide's warnings, she slipped away from her classmates and entered the passage. The walls of the tunnel were close, almost suffocating, and the floor uneven. Laura pressed on, her curiosity driving her deeper into the darkness. Minutes passed, and the realization that she was completely alone began to settle in. The tunnel twisted and turned, and soon, Laura had lost all sense of direction. Panic started to grip her as she realized that she could no longer hear the voices of her classmates. She turned to retrace her steps, but the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly behind her, the entrance lost in the inky blackness. Back with the group, it was some time before anyone noticed that Laura was missing. Mr. Grayson quickly organized a search, retracing their steps through the cave. The students called out Laura's name, their voices echoing eerily through the chambers, but there was no response. Hours passed, and the initial search turned into a full-scale rescue operation. Experienced cavers joined the effort, combing every inch of the cave system. But Laura was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of a struggle, no discarded items, nothing to indicate where she might have gone. The search continued for days, but the cave seemed to have swallowed her whole. Despite extensive efforts, Laura's body was never recovered, and her disappearance remains one of Kentucky's most enduring mysteries. Locals have long believed that the cave is cursed, a place where the line between the natural world and the supernatural blurs. Some say that the cave is a gateway to another realm, one that lures the curious and the lost into its depths, never to return. To this day, those who venture too far into the cave's uncharted tunnels report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they are being watched by unseen eyes. Laura's story serves as a chilling reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The Haunted History Museum. In the autumn of 1995, a group of middle school students from a small town in New England set off on a field trip to a local history museum. The museum, housed in a colonial-era building, was famous for its vast collection of artifacts, including clothing, tools, and personal items from the 17th and 18th centuries. The building itself was a relic, with creaking wooden floors, drafty rooms, and a sense of history that hung heavy in the air. As the students entered the museum, they were greeted by the curator, an elderly woman with a voice that seemed as old as the artifacts she cared for. She led the group through the dimly lit rooms, explaining the significance of each exhibit. The students were intrigued, but there was an unease that none of them could quite shake. The museum felt different from other places they had visited, as if it were alive with the spirits of those who had lived and died centuries before. The group eventually reached a room filled with antique dolls, each one meticulously crafted and dressed in period clothing. The dolls sat on shelves, their glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. Some were missing limbs or had cracks in their porcelain faces, giving them a sinister appearance. The curator explained that these dolls had belonged to children from wealthy families, cherished toys that had been passed down through generations. One of the students, a boy named Tommy, felt an overwhelming sense of dread as he entered the room. He couldn't take his eyes off one particular doll, a small, delicate figure with dark hair and a faded blue dress. The doll's eyes seemed different from the others, almost lifelike in their intensity. As the curator spoke, Tommy felt as though the doll was watching him, its gaze following him wherever he moved. When the group left the room to continue the tour, Tommy lingered behind, unable to tear himself away from the doll. The room was silent except for the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. Suddenly, Tommy felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, expecting to see one of his classmates, but there was no one there. The room was empty. His heart pounding, Tommy backed away from the doll and hurried to catch up with the others. For the rest of the day, Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He kept glancing over his shoulder, convinced that someone, or something, was following him. That night, after returning home, he woke up in a cold sweat, his heart racing. In the corner of his room, shrouded in darkness, he saw the silhouette of the doll. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the moonlight, were fixed on him. He screamed, but when his parents rushed into the room, the doll was gone. Over the next few days, Tommy became increasingly withdrawn. He refused to go to school, barely spoke, and insisted on keeping all the lights in the house on. His parents, concerned for his well-being, took him to a therapist. Tommy told the therapist about the doll and how it had followed him home, but the therapist dismissed it as a nightmare, a product of an overactive imagination. Despite their reassurances, Tommy's fear only grew. He began to see the doll everywhere, standing at the foot of his bed, peeking around corners, watching him from the shadows. His parents, at a loss, returned to the museum to speak with the curator. They learned that the doll had a dark history. It had once belonged to a little girl named Abigail, who had died under mysterious circumstances. Some believed that her spirit had become attached to the doll, unable to move on. Desperate for answers, Tommy's parents decided to return the doll to the museum, hoping it would bring their son peace. But when they arrived, the curator informed them that the doll had never left the museum. The doll they described was still sitting on its shelf, exactly where it had been during the field trip. Tommy's parents were horrified, but the curator offered them a chilling explanation. Sometimes, objects with a strong attachment can find their way to those who are sensitive to their presence. The doll may have chosen your son for a reason. Despite their efforts, Tommy never fully recovered from the experience. He remained haunted by the doll for years, its image burned into his memory. The museum, now aware of the doll's dark history, moved it to a sealed display case, but visitors still report feeling uneasy in its presence. Some claim to see its eyes following them as they move through the room, while others hear faint whispers, as if the doll is trying to communicate from beyond the grave. The abandoned amusement park. In the summer of 2007, a group of college students from a nearby university decided to visit an abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The park, once a beloved destination for families and thrill seekers, had been closed for over 2 decades following a series of tragic accidents that left the town with a lingering sense of unease. Over time, the park became a place of local legend, whispered about in hushed tones, and avoided by most. The students, Jake, Emily, Sarah, and Tom, were all photography majors, eager to find unique and eerie locations for their final projects. They had heard stories about the abandoned park, with its rusting rides and overgrown paths, and believed it would make the perfect backdrop for their work. After doing some research and finding a way to access the park, they set off early one Saturday morning, their excitement barely contained. The entrance to the park was hidden behind a tangle of trees and thick underbrush, the once grand gates now twisted and covered in rust. The large, faded sign that had once welcomed visitors now hung precariously, creaking in the wind. As they stepped through the gates, the students were struck by the eerie silence that enveloped the park. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, just the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional creak of a long-forgotten ride. The park was a decaying shell of its former self. The Ferris wheel stood motionless, its metal frame corroded and unstable, while the carousel, once vibrant with color, was now covered in vines, its painted horses chipped and faded. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood, and the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on the students. They decided to split up, each one heading to a different part of the park to capture the best shots. Sarah and Tom headed toward the funhouse, intrigued by the peeling paint and shattered mirrors, while Emily was drawn to the crumbling arcade, hoping to find some remnants of the past. Jake, however, was captivated by the roller coaster, a massive wooden structure that loomed over the park like a skeletal giant. The coaster, once the main attraction of the park, was now a dangerous ruin. The wooden beams were warped and rotted, the tracks twisted and broken in places. Despite the obvious risks, Jake was determined to get a shot from the top, convinced it would be the highlight of his portfolio. He carefully made his way up the rickety stairs, each step groaning under his weight. As he climbed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He paused several times, glancing over his shoulder, but saw nothing but the overgrown remains of the park. At the top of the coaster, he stopped to catch his breath, taking in the view of the desolate landscape below. The wind howled through the structure, causing it to sway slightly, but Jake was focused on getting the perfect shot. He raised his camera, framing the twisted tracks against the cloudy sky. That's when he saw it, a figure standing on the tracks a few yards away. The man was dressed in a faded amusement park uniform, complete with a name tag that was too worn to read. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow, and he stood perfectly still, staring at Jake. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he lowered his camera, thinking one of his friends was playing a prank on him. "Very funny, guys," he called out, his voice shaky. But the figure didn't move or respond. Jake's unease grew as he realized that the man wasn't one of his friends, and something about him felt profoundly wrong. The figure suddenly turned and walked further down the track, disappearing into the shadows of the coaster's structure. Against his better judgment, Jake followed, his curiosity overriding his fear. As he descended the steps, the sense of being watched intensified, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He reached the bottom of the coaster, where the figure had vanished, but there was no sign of him. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized how silent the park had become. The wind had died down, and the oppressive stillness was suffocating. He quickly snapped a few photos, hoping to capture any trace of the mysterious figure, and then hurried back to find his friends. Jake found Emily in the arcade, staring at a dusty old pinball machine. "You won't believe what I just saw," he said, breathless from both fear and exertion. He described the figure on the coaster, but Emily was skeptical. "It was probably just a shadow," she said dismissively, though she couldn't completely hide the unease in her voice. The group reconvened near the entrance, eager to review their photos and leave the park behind. As they scrolled through the images on their cameras, they noticed something strange. In every picture Jake had taken near the roller coaster, the figure appeared, always watching, always just out of reach. Even more unsettling was the fact that the figure had not been visible to Jake when he took some of the shots. It seemed to materialize in the photos, a ghostly presence captured by the camera but invisible to the naked eye. Disturbed by the images, the students quickly packed up their gear and left the park, their earlier excitement replaced by a sense of dread. They vowed never to return, but the experience continued to haunt them. Back at the university, they did some research into the park's history and uncovered a chilling story. Years before the park's closure, a ride operator had died in a tragic accident on the very roller coaster Jake had photographed. The man, whose name was Michael, had been working alone late at night when a malfunction caused one of the cars to derail. Michael had been crushed beneath the wreckage, his body not discovered until the next morning. Rumors spread that Michael's spirit never left the park, condemned to wander the grounds for eternity. Jake and his friends were shaken by the revelation, and they couldn't help but wonder if the figure they had seen was Michael's restless spirit, trapped in the place of his untimely death. The photos Jake had taken became infamous among their classmates, who all agreed that the park was cursed. Even years later, Jake couldn't forget the eerie encounter. The figure's hollow eyes and ghostly presence haunted his dreams, and he avoided talking about the incident whenever possible. The abandoned amusement park became a local legend, with stories of ghostly sightings and strange occurrences passed down through generations. Some thrill-seekers tried to visit the park, but most were too frightened by the stories to venture inside. The park remained abandoned, a decaying monument to a tragic past. And though the rides stood silent and still, those who dared to visit after dark swore they could hear the faint creak of the roller coaster and catch glimpses of a shadowy figure watching from the tracks, a reminder that some spirits are never truly at rest.